August 19, 1968. Prague. The sound of tank treads grinding against cobblestone echoes through the narrow streets of the old town. Rebecca Cole stands at the window of a third-floor apartment, her fingers trembling against the glass as she watches Soviet armor roll past like mechanical beasts claiming territory. The air smells of diesel fuel and fear. Behind her, on a small wooden table, lies a leather-bound notebook. Inside its pages are names, addresses, meeting locations. The entire underground network of Czech dissidents she has been documenting for the past 6 months. And every single entry was provided by the man she loves. The man who, she discovered only hours ago, is an agent of the St. B, the Czechoslovak state security. Milan Dvorak, the translator who guided her through Prague's hidden corners, the lover who whispered promises in the dark, the traitor who has been feeding information to the very regime she came to expose. The notebook feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. Outside, history is being crushed under Soviet steel. Inside, Rebecca faces a choice that will define not just her life, but the lives of everyone whose name appears in those pages. She has perhaps 2 hours before Milan returns, 2 hours to decide whether to run or to stay. 2 hours to choose between justice and love, between survival and sacrifice. The clock on the wall ticks forward. The tanks keep rolling. And Rebecca Cole must make a decision that no training, no ideology, no moral compass can simplify. This is the story of that decision, and the confrontation that followed. Rebecca had arrived in Prague in February of 1968, when hope still bloomed like crocuses through melting snow. She was 28 years old, a freelance journalist with credentials from 3 American magazines, and a burning desire to document what everyone was calling the Prague Spring. Alexander Dubček had risen to power as first secretary of the Communist Party, promising socialism with a human face. Censorship was loosening. Artists were speaking freely. Students were debating politics in cafes without glancing over their shoulders. For the first time in 2 decades, Czechoslovakia seemed to be breathing. Rebecca wanted to capture that breath before winter returned. She had been warned, of course. Her editor at Harper's Magazine had pulled her aside before she left New York. "You need a translator you can trust," he had said. "Someone who understands what you are trying to do. Someone who will not report your sources to the authorities." She had nodded, understanding the weight of those words. But she had not understood, not really, how complicated trust would become. Milan Dvorak had been recommended by a contact at the American Embassy. He was 32, a former literature professor who had lost his university position for refusing to denounce a colleague during the purges of the early 60s. He spoke flawless English with a slight British accent, the result of a year spent at Oxford before the borders closed. He was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and defiance. When they first met at a cafe near Wenceslas Square, he had ordered her a coffee and said, in that precise English of his, "You want to write about hope. That is good, but you must also write about memory. Hope without memory is just propaganda." She had known in that moment that she wanted to work with him. What she had not known was that she would fall in love with him. It happened slowly, the way spring arrives in increments. A shared joke during an interview. His hand steadying her elbow on icy steps. The way he translated not just words but emotions, capturing the tremor in a dissident poet's voice, the defiance in a student organizer's laugh. By April, they were spending evenings together, walking along the Vltava River as the city transformed around them. By May, they were lovers. He took her to places tourists never saw. Underground theaters where band plays were performed in basements. Apartments where intellectuals gathered to read forbidden books. Churches where priests spoke quietly about freedom and faith. And everywhere they went, Rebecca took notes. She documented names, faces, stories. She was building a comprehensive portrait of the resistance, the people who were pushing Czechoslovakia towards something resembling democracy. Milan was her guide through all of it. He introduced her to people who would never have spoken to a foreign journalist without his endorsement. He translated their words with care and precision. He helped her understand the complex web of relationships and histories that define the movement. And she trusted him completely. In June, they spent a weekend in a cottage outside Prague, borrowed from one of Milan's friends. They made love in a room with windows overlooking a meadow full of wildflowers. Afterward, as they lay tangled in sheets, he had traced his finger along her collarbone and said, "If this all falls apart, if the Soviets come, promise me you will leave. Promise me you will not try to be a hero." She had laughed, kissing his shoulder. "They would not dare," she had said. "The world is watching." He had not laughed. He had simply held her tighter, and she had felt, for just a moment, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. By July, the signs were impossible to ignore. Soviet troops were conducting exercises along the border. Pravda was publishing increasingly hostile articles about Czechoslovak revisionism. Dubček was being summoned to Moscow for tense meetings. The optimism of spring was curdling into the anxiety of summer. Rebecca worked faster, conducting more interviews, documenting more stories. She felt a journalist's urgency, the need to capture everything before the window closed. Milan helped her with every step. He arranged meetings. He translated. He took her to a safe house in the Vinohrady district where the core organizers of the student movement met twice a week. She filled her notebook with their plans, their hopes, their strategies for peaceful resistance. And Milan was always there, his presence reassuring, his translations impeccable. She never questioned his loyalty. Why would she? He had lost his career for his principles. He spoke with such passion about freedom and dignity. He made love to her with a tenderness that seemed to contradict any possibility of deception. She trusted him with her work. She trusted him with her heart, and that trust, she would later understand, was exactly what made him so effective. On the night of August 20th, Soviet forces would invade. But Rebecca's world had already collapsed hours earlier, on the afternoon of August 19th. She had returned to her apartment unexpectedly. She had been scheduled to interview a playwright in the afternoon, but he had canceled at the last minute, claiming illness. She had decided to go home, to transcribe her notes from the previous day. When she entered the apartment, she heard Milan's voice coming from the bedroom. He was speaking in Czech, his tone low and urgent. She had frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the knob. She spoke only basic Czech, enough for pleasantries and simple transactions, but she understood enough to catch certain words. Names, addresses. The same names and addresses she had written in her notebook. She had moved quietly to the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see Milan sitting on the edge of the bed, a telephone pressed to his ear. He was reading from a small notepad, his handwriting cramped and precise. As she listened, her blood turning to ice, she realized he was reporting on the meeting they had attended the previous evening. The student organizers. Their plans for a peaceful demonstration, the location of their printing press, everything. He was giving them everything. When he hung up the phone, she had stepped into the room. He had looked up, startled, and for a fraction of a second she had seen something in his eyes. Not guilt exactly, Something more complicated. Resignation, perhaps, or relief. She had asked him, her voice barely a whisper, "Who were you talking to?" He had not tried to lie. Perhaps he was too tired for lies, or perhaps he knew that lies would be useless now. The St. B, he had said simply, state security. "I have been reporting to them since March." The room had seemed to tilt. She had gripped the doorframe to steady herself. Since March. Since before they became lovers. Since before he had introduced her to the people whose names he was now turning over to the secret police. Why, she had asked, though the word felt inadequate for the enormity of the betrayal. He had stood up, his movements slow and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Because they gave me no choice," he had said. "They came to me in February before I met you. They knew about my past, my connections to the dissident community. They threatened my sister. She has 2 children. They said if I did not cooperate, they would ensure she lost custody, that the children would be placed in state care. They were very specific about what that would mean." Rebecca had felt tears on her cheeks, though she had not been aware of crying. "And us," she had said. "What about us? Was that part of the assignment?" He had flinched as if she had struck him. "No," he had said. "That was real. Everything between us was real." But even as he said it, she had wondered how she could ever believe him again. How could she separate the truth from the performance? Had he loved her, or had he simply been very good at his job? He had reached for her, but she had stepped back. "Do not touch me," she had said. He had lowered his hand. "Rebecca, please, you have to understand. I was trying to protect my family. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could give them enough to satisfy them without truly endangering anyone." But she had seen her notebook on the table. She had seen the names. "How many people are going to be arrested because of you?" she had asked. "How many?" He had not answered. The silence had been answer enough. She had grabbed the notebook and her passport. She had walked out of the apartment without looking back, his voice calling after her, pleading, explaining, justifying. She had not listened. She had gone to the safe house in Vinohrady, the one where the student organizers met. It was empty when she arrived, but she had a key. Milan had given it to her weeks ago. The irony was not lost on her. She had locked herself in the basement, a cramped space with a single window near the ceiling and a radio on a shelf. And there, as the afternoon faded into evening, as the radio began reporting Soviet troop movements across the border, she had tried to decide what to do. The notebook contained everything. Names, addresses, meeting times, safe houses. If she could get it to the American embassy, they could warn people. They could help some of them escape before the arrests began. But getting to the embassy meant crossing a city that was about to become a war zone. It meant risking capture. And it meant condemning Milan. Because if she exposed him, if she revealed that he was an St. B informant, the dissidents would know. The Americans would know. His life would be over. The regime would discard him as a compromised asset. The dissidents would mark him as a traitor. He would have nothing, no protection from either side. And despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, a part of her still loved him. Or perhaps it was not love anymore, but the ghost of love, the memory of what she had felt when she believed he was someone else. She had sat in that basement, listening to the radio, and hated herself for hesitating. Then, just after 8 in the evening, she had heard footsteps on the stairs. The door had opened. Milan had stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat. He must have run across the city to find her. "I knew you would come here," he had said. Rebecca had stood up, the notebook clutched against her chest. "You should not have followed me." He had descended the stairs, closing the door behind him. The basement suddenly felt very small. "I had to," he had said. "Rebecca, please listen to me." She had shaken her head. "There is nothing you can say. You betrayed them. You betrayed me. I know," he had said, and his voice had cracked. "I know what I did. But you have to understand, I was trying to protect my family. I was trying to survive. We are all trying to survive. Survival is not an excuse for what you did," she had said. "People are going to die because of you." He had flinched again, and she had seen, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what he carried. He looked older than he had that morning, as if years had passed in the span of hours. "I did not want this," he had said quietly. "I never wanted any of this. I wanted to teach literature. I wanted to live in a country where I could speak freely. I wanted to love you without it being part of some larger game. But that is not the world we live in. The world we live in is one where they threaten your sister's children, and you have no choice but to comply. Where you meet a woman you could love, and you have to decide every day whether to protect her or to protect yourself. I made my choices. I know they were wrong, but I made them to keep the people I love alive." Rebecca had felt her anger warring with something else. Pity, perhaps, or understanding. She did not want to understand. Understanding felt like forgiveness, and she was not ready to forgive. The radio crackled. A news bulletin. "Soviet forces have entered Czechoslovakia. Reports of tanks in the streets of Prague. Resistance is reported in several districts. Casualties are being confirmed." They both fell silent, listening. The world outside was ending. Inside the basement, they were suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. "What are you going to do?" Milan had asked finally. "Are you going to turn me in?" She had looked down at the notebook. "I should," she had said. "I should give this to the embassy and tell them everything. Let them warn people. Let them know you are a traitor." He had nodded slowly. "Yes, you should." But she had not moved. "Why did you come here?" she had asked. "If you knew I would turn you in, why did you follow me?" "Because I could not let you think that none of it was real," he had said. "I could not let you believe that everything between us was a lie. I love you, Rebecca. I know you cannot believe that now. I know I have destroyed any chance of you believing it. But it is true. I have lied about many things, but not about that." She had felt tears again, hot and furious. "How can I believe anything you say? You have been lying to me for months." He had stepped closer, and this time she had not moved away. "Because you know me," he had said. "You know who I am beneath all of this. You have seen me when I did not have to perform. You have heard me talk about the books I love, the life I wanted. That was not an act. That was me. The man you fell in love with is real. He just made terrible choices to protect the people he could not bear to lose." She had wanted to scream at him. She had wanted to hit him. She had wanted to collapse into his arms and pretend that none of this was happening. Instead, she had asked, "If I give you the notebook, if I let you warn them yourself, would you do it?" He had stared at her. "What?" "Would you warn them?" she had repeated. "The people whose names are in here. Would you contact them and tell them to run before the arrests start?" "I do not understand," he had said. "Why would you trust me to do that?" "Because I am giving you a choice," she had said. "You said you made your decisions to protect your family. Fine. I understand that. But now you have a chance to make a different decision. You can take this notebook and use it to save people instead of condemning them. You can prove that you are not just a victim of circumstance, that you have agency, that you can choose to do the right thing even when it costs you." He had looked at the notebook as if it were a live grenade. "If I do that, if I warn them, the St. B will know. They will know I betrayed them. They will arrest me. Probably," she had said. "But at least you will have done something that matters. At least you will have saved lives instead of destroying them." "And what about my sister?" he had asked. "What about her children?" Rebecca had felt the weight of that question. She had no answer that did not involve sacrifice. Someone was going to suffer. The only question was who. "I cannot make that choice for you," she had said, "but I can tell you this. If you do nothing, if you let the arrests happen, you will carry that guilt for the rest of your life. You will know that you had a chance to make amends and you chose not to. Maybe that is easier than facing the consequences of defying the sent be, but it is not the same as being innocent." He had been silent for a long time. Outside, the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. The radio continued its grim litany of invasion and resistance. Finally, he had spoken. "If I do this, if I warn them, will you leave? Will you get out of Prague before they come for you too?" She had nodded. "Yes, I will leave." "Then give me the notebook," he had said. She had hesitated. This was the moment. Once she handed it over, she would have no proof, no evidence to give the embassy. She would be trusting a man who had already betrayed her once, but she had also seen something in his eyes. Desperation, yes. Fear, certainly, but also a kind of resolve. He was making a choice. Perhaps the first real choice he had made in months. She had given him the notebook. He had taken it with both hands, holding it as if it were something sacred. "I am sorry," he had said, "for everything." "I know," she had replied. "Now go. Do what you need to do." He had turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Rebecca," he had said. "Yes. If we survive this, if we both somehow make it through, do you think you could ever forgive me?" She had not known how to answer that. Forgiveness felt impossible in that moment, a luxury that belonged to a future she could not imagine. "I do not know," she had said, "but I think you should stop asking for forgiveness and start earning redemption." He had nodded. Then he had climbed the stairs and disappeared into the night. Rebecca had waited in the basement for another hour, listening to the radio, listening to the city tear itself apart. Then she had gathered her things and made her way to the American embassy. She had arrived just before midnight, exhausted and terrified. The embassy was in chaos, Americans and Czechs crowding the halls, desperate for visas, for protection, for escape. She had found a consular officer she knew slightly and told him she needed to leave immediately. He had arranged for her to join a convoy departing at dawn. She had spent the night in a cramped office, unable to sleep, wondering if Milan was keeping his promise. Wondering if he was already in a cell somewhere being interrogated. Wondering if she had made the right choice. She would not know for years. It was not until 1975, 7 years after the invasion, that she learned what had happened. She was living in Washington by then, working as an editor at the Washington Post. She received a letter, forwarded through a series of contacts, postmarked from Vienna. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in English. "Rebecca," it read, "I kept my promise. I warned as many as I could. 14 people escaped because of the notebook. 14 lives. It is not enough to balance the scales, but it is something. The St.B. arrested me 3 days after you left. I spent 2 years in prison. When I was released, I was no longer useful to anyone. My sister and her children are safe. They do not speak to me, but they are safe. I defected to Austria last year. I teach literature again at a small university. I think about you often. I think about the choice you gave me. I do not know if I have earned redemption, but I am trying. I hope you are well. I hope you have found peace. I will always love you. Milan." Rebecca had read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. She had not replied. She did not know what she would say, but she kept the letter. And sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and read it again, remembering the basement, the radio, the moment when love and ideology and survival had collided. 14 lives. It was not enough, but it was something. And in the calculus of betrayal and redemption, perhaps something was all anyone could hope for. The Prague Spring had ended. The tanks had rolled in. The dream of socialism with a human face had been crushed. But in a basement in Vinohrady, on a night when the world was ending, two people had made choices that mattered. Rebecca had chosen to offer redemption instead of revenge. Milan had chosen to accept it, even knowing the cost. And in the intelligence files of both nations, in the reports and debriefings and classified documents, their story would remain. A footnote to history. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when betrayal seems absolute, there is still room for choice. Still room for something that might, in time, resemble grace.